Hi everyone, this is the videos that introduce the two readings for the second module, the second week in SGS 303. And this week we're talking about parties and the party systems. The two readings this time, they look at party systems across Europe mostly. Europe's a great place to look. I mean, if you're a comparative politics person, because there's a lot of different countries there, right? Each with its own party system, each with its own political system, right? The rules of the game, constitutions, that sort of thing. Some things that they certainly share in common, like the European Union, and sort of a shared common history and that sort of thing. But in the same way, right, that the United States is states, right? It's divided into 50 states, right? And that's sort of laboratories of democracy where maybe some things happen in Arizona that don't in California, for example, and you can kind of compare and see the results of different political systems and different political policies and different party systems and that sort of thing. So I want to start off by sort of explaining basically what's meant by a party system. I want to talk about party systems, then cleavages, because both of these papers talk about cleavages. So sort of based on or understand as part of their analysis the idea of cleavages. The first one, the first reading, that deals much more directly with cleavages, but they're certainly relevant to the second one too. So I'll sort of end there with that sort of explanation. Maybe if you're lucky, if you get that far, that's probably good. That probably sets you up nicely to do the reading. But I might put some things after that. Okay, so the idea then is that party systems exist, right? So party systems vary according to country. So we'll talk about in the United States, we'll talk about party systems. It's a two-party system basically, right? And there's Republicans and there's Democrats. And we're almost getting into cleavages if I start to talk about the constituencies that tend to vote either Republican or Democrat. And so you have this sort of this two-party system where everybody, and this is not quite true, right, because there's a lot of independence in the United States, but generally speaking, right, well, there's also smaller parties, right, third parties like the Green Party or the Libertarian Party, but generally speaking, right, and this is, you know, we could talk about the American party system as being sort of characterized as a two-party system, and what you've sort of got, right, is maybe a Liberal Party and a Conservative Party. That's probably what we've got. And the Liberal Party would be the Democratic these days, right? The current party system, right? The Democratic Party is probably the Liberal Party. You know, and what does that mean? That has sort of implications economically and socially. And certainly more recently, right, the Democratic Party has been, well, and we'll talk about this when we maybe speak specifically about the second reading, but, you know, the Democratic Party has certainly since the 1990s been, for example, sort of big on internationalism, right? So cooperation with other nation states and with international organizations, open trade, right, free trade, which has not always been the case with the Democratic Party. And again, that's something that's interesting in the European context as well. Republicans, certainly much more recently, although we could probably say that generally, like if we look at the same sort of timeline of the 1990s, Republicans have been probably generally quite supportive also of free trade and international trade. And that's a story that's not uncommon around the rest of the world, right? There's sort of both parties, right, or all parties, or all the main parties, sort of in favor of this international free trade, in favor of globalization. And that's something that maybe happens for the Democrats in the 1990s and something that only recently have the Republican Party under Trump sort of moved away from. And this is the sort of thing that these two readings are studying. Right? Certainly the second reading especially is studying the changes in party platforms as a response to globalization. Right? What do parties do? And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So the party system, so it varies, right? In America, you've got two parties. One we can call liberal, I'm calling liberal, Democrats, the Democratic Party, and one we can call, let's say, conservative. Although for me, oftentimes I feel like they're both liberal in the sort of classical or in the European sense of the word liberal, which we'll cover in a second. But maybe we've got a Conservative and a Liberal Party, perhaps. A centre-right and a centre-left, maybe. Okay. And of course, in different countries that varies. So in the United Kingdom, it's a fairly similar party system, right? Except that what we would say probably is we have a Conservative Party, right, which is called the Conservative Party and has a sort of history of conservatism and a tradition of conservatism, support for the established church, support for other institutions like the military and universities, but also, and this is probably more recent, but I wouldn't make too much of that. I don't see much of a change, but sort of support for business and business owners would be more the Conservative Party. And certainly it has close connections to the City of London, right? The financial services industry that's big in England. So there's the Conservative Party. You've got a second party, the Labour Party, that is a social democratic party, right? Not quite so, well, you know, they do start off as a socialist party, right? In the early 20th century, but they sort of have since the 80s, since the 90s, have veered off a little bit more to the right to make them, well, and maybe you would always talk about them as a social democratic party. Actually, in the 1980s, and this is pertinent because what we're going to say about Britain is it has a party system with 2.5 parties. And the half a party is this, right? So in the 80s, the Labour Party started fighting within itself. One wing wants to maintain its socialist roots. The other one says, no, that socialism's not getting us anywhere. We need to move towards more of a social democratic way, more of a sort of much closer to the centre. And there's a fight, and a group of MPs split away from the Labour Party, and they break away, and they make a new party called the Social Democratic Labour Party. Oh no, Social Democratic and Liberal Party, I think, actually, because what they do is they join together with this really old party that wasn't getting anywhere for 100 years, the Liberal Party. So you've got SDLP, and then what happens is they change their name to the Liberal Democrats, and so this is the sort of half a party. And actually, in 2010, there was a hung parliament, and they joined the government in coalition with the Conservative Party. So what you had is like you had sort of a 2.5 party system where you've got the Conservative and the Labour Party, which are the main parties, and then you had this sort of third party that could maybe cooperate with other parties to form a government, but probably couldn't win on its own, right? So that's a different political party system. And if you look at Italy, right, you'd see many more parties, and you'd see coalitions of parties sort of joining together. You know, and you might have 2 or 3 parties on the right, 2 or 3 parties on the left, and you might have a lot of really quite small parties that then come together in coalition. So that's a completely different party system. And so this is what we're talking about. We're talking in both cases, in both of these papers, about changes in party systems across different countries, based on the rise of globalization. And we're saying, well, what are these changes? How have these affected, how have these globalization, the intensification of globalization, how has it altered the structure of the party system, right? How many parties there are, what types of parties there are, what those parties stand for, how have those things been altered? And the reason why that's interesting, right? The reason why we should care about that, and this is said, I think, in both of the papers, is this, that we should care about that because parties are sort of the interface between the population and the government, right? The parties, voting for parties, voting for party candidates is the way that people, the electorate, affect politics. And so there has been, until fairly recently, there has been a supposition that actually parties aren't doing that job very well, that they're not really representing the values and the preferences and the interests of their constituents. And there's been some argument in the literature, and you can kind of see the what's the word, the residue, I guess, of that argument in these papers, right? Because this is what they're arguing against, both of these. And the argument is this: the argument is that the parties have become disconnected from the voters, that the changes in political beliefs, in political attitudes of voting people is not represented in changes in political parties. The political parties have become separate from the rest of the population, and that they just do whatever they do, like, regardless of what the voting public say. So the argument here in both of these papers that you'll see running through it that you should look for is that this is not the case, because we see as people have turned increasingly hostile towards globalization. You know, what have parties done? Parties, well, I don't want to give too much of the game away, right? Parties have, but I will though. Parties have risen, new parties have formed and risen up. And they mention in one of them Germany and Britain. Far-right parties, and this is particularly what they're talking about. They're talking about in Northern Europe, far-right parties, in Southern Europe, radical left parties. Right? Radical right in the north, radical left in the south. I think I said far-right. I usually don't like to say far-right, I like to say radical, right? Because radical right and radical left, in that they, and radical just meaning simply that they both, you know, on the radical left and on the radical right, are proposing and asking for and demanding and where they can, putting in place fundamental changes to political systems, fundamental changes to the rules of the game as it's played in those countries, right? So that's why we're calling them the radical right and radical left. So and so we're seeing these, and this is one of the arguments of the second of the Lacewell papers, right? Of the Lacewell's paper that traditional existing parties in the established party structures are not, we're not perhaps making, we're not equipped to deal with a backlash against globalization. And so now you're seeing the rise of other outside parties. And that's not all that it's arguing. It's arguing some other interesting things. So that's party systems. These papers are about how these party systems are sort of standing up and how they're adjusting and how they're trying, or how they're not adjusting to this backlash against globalization. So that's the general thing to note. Now, I said I'd talk about cleavages a bit, and we haven't quite got there yet, but we're close, right? Because when we talk about party systems, one of the questions is about how do party systems come about? Right? Why is there a conservative party and a socialist or a social democratic party that dominates British politics? Why is it that in Italy there's a lot of smaller parties? Right? Why is it in the United States it's two big parties? You know, why is and there's lots of answers to those questions. But one of the answers, and I think in the first paper it talks about this, explains maybe 8 to 10%, depending on the country, right? And depending on other things that I can't remember right now, but you should watch out for them. Of voting behavior, these things called cleavages. And cleavages, the sort of theory of cleavages, they belong to Lipset, in a big way are associated with that. Well, I think Aaron Liebhardt as well, I think I remember, but he's not mentioned in either of these papers. They mentioned Lipset both times, but that's okay. And the idea is basically this, right? The party structures form on top of cleavages in society, that they're representing these cleavages. And so cleavages along, some examples of cleavages are these. One cleavage might be urban people versus people in the country. Another cleavage might be religious people versus non-religious people, or Protestants versus Catholics, or non-conformists, you know, and I'm thinking of Britain probably here, non-conformists versus Church of England, right? Which might be, you know, Church of England might be more traditionally within the Labour Party, and the non-conformists, sorry, Church of England might be traditionally voting Conservative, whereas non-conformists like Methodists and Baptists and those guys might be voting more Labour Party. That's traditional. That's a fairly traditional cleavage. So, so there you go. Those are examples of cleavages, and what they are is that they're separations, they're groups, but they're enduring identity groups. Enduring fundamental identity groups within a society that then political parties sort of collect a bunch of these groups, right? Like a coalition, they collect a bunch of these groups. And the thing is, the reason why it's so important is that makes political parties quite stable over generations and generations. So if you are, like, I'm going to go back to Britain again, right? But if you're in the north, and I talked about this a little bit last time, if you're in the northeast of England, right, there's a geographic cleavage. Right? If you're in the northeast of England, you're very likely to vote Labour. And conversely, up until fairly recently, if you were the southwest of England, you were quite likely to vote Liberal Democrat, and there's still more of a chance that you will now. Now, sometimes these change, but the point of them is that actually they lend quite a lot of stability and quite a lot of inflexibility to political parties. Political parties can't just change the policies as they want. And this is another theory that you'll see sort of contended with in these papers, the theory that political parties, there's some sort of a market, right, for political positions. Right? There's a market for political platforms, and what political parties have the freedom just to sort of produce and sell to voters anything. And people who take more the cleavages side of things say, no, that's impossible, right? Because the parties rely on these set groups that if they went against the interests of those set groups, right, they'd be undermining their very foundation. Okay, and so this is why in the second paper in particular, right, you see a lot of, well, I'm going to give you an example now, and I think this is about as far as I'll go, and then I'll leave it to you. Let me emphasize that these papers contain quite a lot more detail than I'm giving you here. And they explain it in a lot more detail, but they're talking about more than just this. What I'm giving you now is the sort of, I think it's the foundation for you to sort of understand what's going on in the papers, for you to say, okay, I know what to expect here, right? But it's certainly not giving you everything. But I will give you a few more things just in this video, but I'm scratching the surface, okay? All right. So, so to give you an example of sort of political parties, political structures and cleavages, and this is all from Lacewell, I think. One of the things they talk about is the decline of social democratic parties in Europe. So they're not just talking about the Labour Party, which would probably fit into that description. They're not just talking about the Social Democrats in Germany. Lots of European countries have parties that are called the Social Democratic Party. In Macedonia, in North Macedonia, it's called the SDSM, Social Democratic Union of Macedonia. In Greece, they have PASOK. Yeah, they used to have PASOK. PASOK got decimated, and this is the thing, right? I think I put that in my syllabus. But this is the thing that they talk about the decline of social democratic parties, and one of the reasons is this. So one of the cleavages that was common across all of Europe, less so in the United States, but across much of the world, was the class divide. Right, a cleavage based on class, so that if you were a working person, you worked for a living, basically, which means just basically everybody that doesn't own a business, right, that doesn't sort of run or doesn't earn income from ways other than having a job, right, which might be owning your own business, right, or might be, for some people, I suppose, right, they can live off sort of accrued capital, right, where you get a big amount of capital and you invest that and sort of live off the interest, live off the dividends and the appreciation in the value of your assets and that sort of thing. And that's actually becoming more and more prevalent throughout the world, actually, but certainly Europe and North America. But that was the cleavage, right? Those who worked for a living and those who didn't work for a living, who earned a living other ways. And when I say work, of course, other people work as well, not just, but people who had a job, who got a salary, right, and people who didn't, right, and that was one cleavage. And basically, like in Britain and in many European countries, the centre-left party was the party of the workers, and then the centre-right party was the party of business. so then you had sort of the center-left party, the Social Democratic parties, who were big into like welfare states, big into generous social safety nets, because generally speaking, it's working people who are most at risk, maybe losing, if you lose your job, that's your stream of income. Of course, you could lose your business and things, but yeah. And the argument goes something like this: as back in the 70s, you had a lot of Keynesian economics, right? You had a lot of government spending, right? Sort of high taxes, high spending economies all over the world, in Europe and Western Europe as well as Eastern Europe. That model, that economic model, was seen by the end of the 70s as a bit of a failure, in fact, right? And in Britain in particular, right, there was sort of big shutdowns of industry for 3 or 4 days out of the week. And generally speaking, that mode of that economic system fell out of favor, and think Thatcher here, think Thatcher, and think Reagan here, and in came this new neoliberal economic system at the beginning of the 80s. By the 90s, what we're seeing is an increase in international trade as well. And now, I hesitate because I don't want to make this too simplistic, but because what I'm about to say is fairly controversial, but there's also something in that people became wealthier. The material benefits that people got generally started to increase into the 90s. People were better off. And when people's sort of basic material needs are met, which was becoming increasingly the case, those issues of class, of sort of working people struggling to survive, struggling to earn enough money to feed themselves and their children and to live in a proper house and that sort of thing, those sorts of struggles, and that's why it's controversial, that hasn't gone away, right? That still exists. But it was much less salient, and what became much more salient were post-materialist issues, things like identity, right? Whether that's sort of a national identity on the right, or whether that's sexual or other types of identity that the left are interested in, perhaps more, right? These are all post-materialist. Post-materialist just means like sort of, it's not economic, right? These are not economic things. These are other parts of living standards there. And so, so we have the rise of post-materialism. With this rise of post-materialism now, the social democratic parties, whose sort of main platform was about economic justice, was about economic welfare and benefits for at-risk workers, their platform became less salient, and so they became less popular. That's the argument that we're seeing. That's the sort of the party decline. And so now we have a cleavage, which is the class cleavage, which seems to be receding and taking with it the old party system. All right, and have a look at Lacewell as well, and see what else, see what the social democratic parties are doing, right, in order to try and mitigate this sort of this offense, I guess, on their political area, right? This sort of undermining of their political platforms, and if you look for examples of that, if you go and if you read the syllabus, the description, you'll see PASOK. That's exactly what we mean here, right? If you look at the situation in Germany, right, where you've got the Social Democratic Party and the Christian Democratic Party now, the old party system, are in unity together. They're clinging together against the rise of the more radical parties. And by more radical parties, I do mean radical right parties. I also mean radical left parties, and in Germany has both of those. The other thing is things like green parties. The green parties, that remember, the green parties are sort of focused on environmental justice, social justice, not as much economic justice, which is more the traditional left, right? And so you see the benefit. And so in Lacewell, what we see is like sort of, we talk about the winners and losers of globalization in terms of individuals, and a good way to think about that is, individuals with movable assets, with mobile assets, like education is one, right? They do quite well in globalization. Those with fixed assets that don't move very well, immobile assets, I suppose, are perhaps amongst the losers. So in this, when we look at parties, we see that parties of business and trade and business, usually centre-right Conservative Party, Christian Democrat parties, they are the winners of globalization, and the losers of globalization are the social democratic parties. The other winners are the Green parties, right? The post-materialist parties, like the Green Party, like the Brexit Party, like Pegida in Germany. Maybe not these days, Pegida, but what's the other one? Alternative for Deutschland. Look at Italy as well. Look at the League La Lega. Used to be called the Northern League, but now they're just the League. That's Salvini's party, of course. Look at them, right? The post-materialist. People used to see themselves as sort of workers against the bosses, or bosses against the workers, I suppose, as well, right? Against the trade unions. Those cleavages are breaking down, and now other cleavages are perhaps coming up and taking their place. The established parties are not, according to Lacewell, equipped or able to cope with that, and so we're seeing the rise of these new parties. So there you go. That should be more than enough, I think, to get into the reading this week. It's an exciting week. I think it's one that I found very interesting as I was reading through these. And so watch out for the quiz that's coming up on that. It's not quite finished as I'm making this video, but it will be before the start of the week next week. So I'm only like halfway through it. All right.